It was about 34 minutes into an imagined primetime showdown when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still believed she was walking through her own victory lap. Not a cheap sparring match with some cardboard cutout in a stiff suit she could wave off as out of touch, but a matchup she thought would certify her as the millennial spokesperson on the biggest stage. Across from her stood J.D. Vance, framed in this scenario as the rare Republican she couldn't dismiss with one line and a smirk. The kind of opponent who speaks fluent same generation and doesn't look intimidated by applause. Her team had supposedly treated the night like a viral operation. Wardrobe calibrated for camera, sound bites sharpened, answers rehearsed for the moments that get clipped and replayed. The plan was simple. Make people feel the urgency, make them feel the righteousness, and let the audience do the rest. And for a while, the formula looked like it would work again. The set in Atlanta was staged like a civics class turned into a sports broadcast. Two podiums angled toward each other, crowd wrapped around them, cameras ready to catch every flinch. The audience, in this story, was carefully balanced, half progressive, half conservative, all under 40, all opinionated enough to fill the room with tension before anyone spoke. Jake Tapper was placed between them like a referee who knows the crowd didn't come for a polite exchange. And as the countdown ended, you could almost hear the unspoken expectation. Somebody was going to get embarrassed, and everyone wanted it to be the other person. AOC opened the way she always opens when the spotlight is hot. Urgency, crisis, moral clarity, climate, inequality, healthcare, student debt, stacked like a closing argument meant to leave the jury no choice but guilty. She hit the phrases that travel well, the lines that feel like slogans because they're designed to be remembered. The progressive half of the room responded exactly on cue, cheering the way people cheer when they hear a speech that sounds like their own frustration finally got a microphone. She smiled like someone who believed the night was already bending in her direction. Then Vance's reply, in this constructed version, didn't come as the expected denial or insult. He started by agreeing with the problems, which is the rhetorical move that steals the easy fight and leaves only the hard one. He didn't argue that climate wasn't real or that healthcare wasn't expensive. He argued that slogans aren't solutions and vibes aren't a budget. And he set a trap by calling it the opposite of a trap. No gotchas, no personal swipes, just a request for mechanics and math. If the plan is real, he implied, it should survive basic questions. If it can't, then what exactly have people been cheering for? The first big test was healthcare, because it's the safest place to be emotionally and the riskiest place to be financially. AOC painted the picture people love: universal coverage, no premiums, no deductibles, no surprise bills, and a clean break from insurance company headaches. It sounded comforting in the way a guarantee always sounds comforting when the details are still blurry. Then Vance asked the kind of question that makes a room stop moving. Does this end private employer-based insurance for roughly 180 million people? Yes or no? She answered with a transition and better coverage, which is a yes dressed in softer clothing. From there, he did what his supporters always want him to do, and what her supporters always hope nobody will do to her. He put numbers in the air. In the story, he cited a mainstream estimate, around $34 trillion over a decade, and treated it less like a talking point and more like a starting line. He translated it into yearly spending and compared it to the existing federal budget, not to score a cheap point, but to force the scale into plain English. And then he asked the question that turns moral passion into administrative reality. Where does the money come from? In actual categories, in amounts that add up. That's when the rhythm changed, because inspiration is fast and arithmetic is slow. AOC reached for the familiar toolbox, tax the wealthy, close loopholes, financial transaction taxes, savings from cutting waste. Those are the answers that land well in a room that doesn't insist on totals. Vance, in this scenario, didn't roll his eyes or sneer. He simply treated each revenue stream like a line item and kept asking what came next. If the wealth tax yields X and the loopholes yield Y, he pressed, what covers the remaining trillions? And how confident are you in those assumptions? And if she pivoted to broad ideas like economic growth, he asked for the growth rate she was relying on, as if this were a business plan instead of a rally. That's the moment the town hall energy shifts from performance to discomfort. Because now the crowd isn't judging who has the better values. They're judging who can answer a direct question without changing the subject. AOC tried the line that often works online. You can't put a price tag on saving lives or saving the planet. Vance countered with the line that works in committee rooms. He wasn't disputing urgency. He was asking whether her specific design can be funded without pretending money is a mood. And the cameras, as the story tells it, stayed tight on her face, because hesitation is the one expression no speechwriter can fix. When Tapper moved them to the Green New Deal, AOC sounded like herself again. She described it as transformation plus justice, renewables, retrofits, high-speed rail, jobs, support for communities that relied on fossil fuels. It's sweeping on purpose, because sweeping is what makes it feel historic. Vance asked the most boring question on the planet, which is why it's so dangerous. What does it cost? Roughly. She said the resolution was a framework, an aspiration, a set of goals, words that accidentally confess you don't have a price tag. He did the same slow, almost annoying thing. He multiplied. Buildings times average retrofit cost, replaced electricity generation times estimated infrastructure costs, rail miles times comparable projects elsewhere. None of it had to be perfect for the point to land, because the point was scale, not a precise invoice. He put a very large number on the table and then asked her calmly what number she had that was meaningfully different, and why. And when she couldn't produce one, the debate stopped being left versus right, and became prepared versus unprepared. At that point, the tension isn't anger. It's a kind of second-hand embarrassment. People who like her start asking themselves a private question. Did I ever demand details, or did I just demand belief? People who dislike her start asking a different private question. Is this finally the moment she has to answer like a legislator instead of a celebrity? Vance's tone, in this imagined sequence, stayed steady, which made every unanswered question feel louder. And Tapper's attempts to keep it balanced started to look like a teacher trying to keep a student from failing in front of the class. Then came the audience question about Amazon and Queens, a flashpoint that still splits people years later. AOC framed it as standing up to corporate subsidies, refusing to bribe a giant company with public money. That line gets applause because it sounds like dignity, like spine, like someone finally saying no to the usual game. Vance reframed it like an investor looking at returns, jobs promised, wages projected, incentives compared, opportunity cost tallied. And he asked the kind of question that can't be booed away. If you turned down a large inflow of wages to save a smaller subsidy, what did you replace it with? And how many comparable jobs came after? AOC tried the displacement argument because it's real enough to be plausible and broad enough to be hard to falsify on stage. He replied, in this fictionalized rendition, that training and pathways had been part of the arrangement, and he asked how much of that was negotiated versus assumed. He treated "we've been working on it" as a non-answer, because working on it can't be put on a pay stub. Even sympathetic listeners, the story suggests, began to notice a pattern. Big moral framing, thin operational scaffolding, and in a room built for television, silence is the harshest review. The sharpest turn came when the topic drifted toward personal narratives of working-class identity. AOC invoked the version of her story that many supporters see as a symbol: service work, hustling, making it, turning struggle into representation. Vance responded with his own biography as the counterweight, and the temperature dropped, because now it wasn't policy theater, it was competing claims to authenticity. In this dramatized telling, he challenged her framing, suggesting she lived closer to upper-middle-class upbringing than her branding implies, and asked whether the difference matters when selling policy to people who can't afford mistakes. The room, as described, didn't explode. It froze, because even people who hate personal shots recognize how effective they can be. If you're watching, you'd probably ask yourself, is this fair, or is it just a clever way to change the topic? And that's exactly why it works as narrative, because the audience now has something to argue about that isn't a spreadsheet. But Vance pivoted back to the core theme. Consequences land hardest on the people least able to absorb them, so shouldn't proposals be stress-tested before they're marketed as salvation? He didn't need to call anyone evil. He just implied that believing you're right doesn't protect you from being wrong in ways that hurt other people. And he kept returning to the same nagging question: why are the details always treated as optional until someone demands them? When the conversation hit the job's guarantee, the mechanical problem became impossible to hide. AOC described it in values: dignity, meaningful work, public purpose, community needs. Vance asked who assigns the jobs, who manages the workforce, what happens when someone refuses, and what the salary and benefit structure looks like at scale. Those questions are not glamorous, and that's the point. Governance is mostly unglamorous, and any plan that collapses under unglamorous questions is a plan made for posters. He did a rough calculation, millions of workers times average compensation, and asked again, which taxes rise and on whom? And again, the answer wasn't a number. It was a moral insistence. AOC suggested the specifics were implementation details, but Vance argued the specifics are the policy, not footnotes. The audience questions, in this storyline, started sounding less like partisan grenades and more like disappointed curiosity. Supporters asking, "I'm with you, but how does this work?" is a different kind of pressure, because you can't dismiss it as bad faith. And the more she avoided firm commitments, middle-class taxes, timelines, trade-offs, the more the avoidance itself became the headline. By the closing stretch, the dynamic had hardened into something simple and brutal. AOC still had passion, but passion was no longer the scarce resource in the room. Credible detail was. Vance didn't have to win with a knockout line. He won by making the absence of answers feel like the story. Tapper tried to reset the mood with softer prompts about vision, but once the audience has seen you struggle with basics, vision starts sounding like a speech you give while someone else does the work. And in politics, being seen as the person who doesn't do the work is not a label you easily shake. The online aftermath, in this fictionalized retelling, behaved like the internet always behaves. It ate the best moments first. Short clips traveled faster than context, and the most replayed segments were the pauses, the dodges, the "I'd have to consult" admissions that feel harmless until they happen repeatedly. Commentary split into predictable camps: facts and logic, triumphalism on one side, unfair standards, outrage on the other. But the uncomfortable middle was where the real damage lived. Because the questions being asked weren't exotic. They were the entry-level questions people expect you to answer before you try to remodel a national economy. And once people start asking, "Wait, Did anyone ever make her show her work? They don't stop asking it. Progressive friendly voices tried to shift the focus to tone, to style, to whether weaponizing math is a trick. But the counter-question lingered. When did math become a weapon? And when did it become optional? If a plan is truly as necessary as advertised, shouldn't it have the strongest argument, not the vaguest one? If it's supposed to be the future, why does it sound like it's being improvised when someone asks what it costs? And if you want to be treated like a serious governing figure, why are you surprised when people treat your proposals like serious governing obligations? In the story, even sympathetic observers began to whisper a heretical thought. Maybe charisma and competence aren't the same thing. Maybe being good at generating attention isn't proof you're good at designing systems. Maybe a movement can be morally sincere and still be operationally reckless. And maybe pointing that out isn't betrayal, it's quality control. The people who loved AOC for making them feel seen now had to decide whether they also needed her to make them feel secure about execution. And the people who disliked her weren't just enjoying the stumble. They were using it as evidence that her entire style of politics is built for cameras, not consequences. From there, the narrative escalated the way political narratives always escalate, from a bad night to a grand moral lesson. Some declared it the moment the progressive project was exposed as fantasy. Others declared it proof the media only demands details from the left. But a quieter reading, and perhaps the most plausible one even inside a made-for-TV script, is that the night turned into a referendum on preparation. Vance's method, keep asking how, keep asking how much, keep asking who pays, didn't require him to be likable or even correct, down to the decimal to be effective. It required only that she be unable to answer in a way that sounded like she'd ever sat with a calculator long enough to feel the weight of her own promises. And that's where the coronation idea breaks, because coronations assume inevitability. They assume the person on stage is already validated, already proven, already beyond the need to show receipts. But politics, when it's not purely fandom, still has a stubborn demand underneath the drama. Can you explain the thing you want to do in a way that could survive reality? If you can't, you may still be inspiring. You may still be right about the problem. You may still be brilliant at the performance of conviction. Yet the harsh question remains, the one that doesn't care about vibes. If the plan can't be explained, is it a plan? Or is it just a poster that happens to be expensive? The imagined fallout didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way doubt always does, quietly at first, then all at the same time. Within hours, short clips outran the full broadcast, because long explanations never beat uncomfortable pauses in the algorithmic Hunger Games of attention. People weren't sharing grand ideological arguments. They were sharing moments where a simple question hung unanswered. The phrase that stuck wasn't even an insult. It was a shrug, disguised as a challenge. Can you explain this? And once that question attaches itself to a public figure, it doesn't let go easily. Supporters rushed to contextualize, to say no one can calculate trillions on live television, to argue that demanding precision is a way of killing imagination. Critics countered with something colder. She wasn't asked for precision, she was asked for comprehension. Nobody needed a spreadsheet down to the penny. They needed evidence she understood the order of magnitude of what she was proposing. The difference matters, and pretending it doesn't only made the gap feel wider. Because people instinctively know when someone is simplifying versus when someone is guessing. Liberal commentators tried to reframe the exchange as a style mismatch rather than a substance problem. They asked whether politics should really be about accounting exercises instead of moral direction. But even that defense raised an uncomfortable follow-up. Who handles the accounting once the moral direction becomes law? You can inspire voters with values, but budgets don't respond to inspiration, and agencies don't run on vibes. At some point, someone has to do the math, and the night raised the suspicion that no one had. Inside this narrative, Democratic strategists didn't panic publicly, but privately they took notes. Not because they suddenly rejected progressive goals, but because they saw how fragile the messaging became under basic scrutiny. If one high-profile figure couldn't answer these questions, how many others were riding on the same rhetorical shortcuts? And if a Republican vice president could expose that weakness without yelling, what happens when someone less polite tries it? Those aren't ideological questions. They're survival questions. The Green New Deal, once treated as an untouchable symbol, started to feel like a conversation people were afraid to have honestly. Not, do we care about climate change, but are we being told the truth about the trade-offs? Some co-sponsors, in this telling, didn't renounce it. They simply stopped mentioning it. Others asked for revisions, studies, task forces, Washington's polite language for slow this down. The energy shifted from certainty to caution, and that shift alone spoke volumes. AOC herself, in this continuation, didn't disappear overnight. She gave interviews that emphasized passion, urgency, and the danger of letting technocrats smother ambition. But each defense circled the same missing center: how the pieces actually fit together. The more she framed the debate as unfair, the more it sounded like she was arguing with the premise of governance itself. And voters, even sympathetic ones, tend to get nervous when leaders sound allergic to details. The hardest part wasn't the attacks from opponents, it was the questions from allies. When people who voted for you start asking, "Wait, did anyone ever stress test this?" the ground shifts under your feet. They weren't accusing her of bad faith. They were asking whether belief had replaced preparation. That kind of doubt doesn't trend as outrage, but it lingers longer. Because once you notice it, you start noticing it everywhere. In this constructed arc, polling didn't collapse instantly, but it softened at the edges. Support dipped not among critics, but among people who used to defend her reflexively. They still liked her values, but liking someone's values isn't the same as trusting them with implementation. Trust erodes quietly, one unanswered question at a time. And politics, more than anything, runs on trust. A primary challenger entering the picture wasn't framed as rebellion, but as reassurance. Someone with municipal experience, someone who talked about numbers the way mechanics talk about engines. The message wasn't revolutionary, it was competent, which suddenly felt radical by contrast. The subtext was hard to miss. Inspiration is good, but someone still has to run the place. And in districts that live with the consequences of policy, that argument lands. What made the moment stick in this version of events wasn't cruelty or humiliation. It was the simplicity of the method used against her. Vance didn't need to accuse, insult, or exaggerate. He just kept asking how things worked. Every time the answer drifted away from specifics, the drift itself became evidence. And that's why the exchange kept being replayed. It looked less like an ambush and more like a test someone forgot to study for. Political science professors, in this imagined aftermath, began assigning clips not to mock, but to analyze. What happens when rhetoric outruns readiness? How charisma can carry a movement until someone demands operational clarity. Why movements built on urgency often skip the least glamorous work until it's too late. And how media ecosystems reward performance long before they reward preparation. The larger lesson wasn't partisan, even if partisans tried to claim it. It wasn't, progressives are bad. or Republicans are smarter. It was that modern politics has made it possible to build a brand faster than a blueprint. You can be celebrated for the idea long before anyone checks whether the idea survives contact with reality. And when that check finally happens on live television, the shock feels personal even if it's structural. By the time the dust settled in this narrative, the original coronation idea sounded almost ironic. Coronations assume inevitability, but democracy has a way of interrupting inevitability with questions. Sometimes those questions are unfair, sometimes they're hostile, and sometimes they're painfully reasonable. The most damaging ones are usually the last kind, because they don't sound like attacks, they sound like expectations. And that's where the story leaves its lingering tension. Not with a villain exposed or a hero crowned, but with a quieter discomfort. If a leader can't explain the machinery behind their promises, who is supposed to trust that machinery once it starts moving? If politics becomes indistinguishable from performance, who pays when the curtain drops? And if asking, "How does this work?" is enough to derail a political career, what does that say about how lightly those promises were made in the first place? What lingered after the cameras shut off, in this imagined continuation, wasn't outrage so much as recalibration. People went back and re-watched earlier speeches with new ears, noticing how often certainty replaced explanation. Lines that once felt empowering now sounded incomplete, like instructions that skipped the middle steps. That doesn't mean the goals suddenly lost moral force. It means the delivery started to feel unbalanced. And once that imbalance is perceived, it's hard to unsee. In green rooms and group chats, aides and activists argued over what had gone wrong. Some blamed format, insisting that no one can responsibly unpack trillion-dollar programs under studio lights. Others pointed out that Vance hadn't demanded footnotes, just fluency. The disagreement itself exposed the problem. If the only defense is "this setting is unfair," then the setting has already won. Governance doesn't wait for ideal conditions, and voters know that instinctively. What unsettled many observers was how familiar the pattern felt. They'd seen versions of it before, where movements grow fast on moral clarity and social media momentum. Early supporters amplify the message because it feels right, not because it's complete. Over time, the applause becomes proof of correctness, and proof replaces curiosity. Then, one night, someone asks a question that curiosity should have asked years earlier. In this retelling, donors didn't flee dramatically or issue condemnations. They did something more consequential. They hesitated. Hesitation in politics is louder than outrage because it signals calculation. When people who fund campaigns start asking whether a candidate can survive hostile questioning, the money slows. Not out of spite, but out of risk management. The internal conversations shifted from "how do we expand the movement" to "how do we professionalize it?" Policy memos were commissioned after the fact, as if homework could be retroactively submitted. Staffers floated the idea of white papers, advisory councils, phased rollouts. All of it sounded responsible, but all of it also sounded late. Because once doubt enters the bloodstream, reassurance needs to be immediate, not aspirational. AOC's public responses, in this constructed arc, leaned heavily on framing. She argued that critics were confusing imagination with irresponsibility, that transformative change always looks unrealistic until it happens. History was invoked, as it often is, as proof that skeptics have always been wrong. But history, inconveniently, also shows that successful transformations were usually accompanied by obsessive planning. The New Deal wasn't a vibe. It was a pile of legislation thicker than most people realize. Some progressive allies quietly urged a pivot. Less emphasis on sweeping declarations, more on incremental wins that demonstrate competence. Pick one piece of the vision, they suggested, and build it in public. Slowly, visibly. Show the math. Show the trade-offs. Show the compromises you hate but accept anyway. That's how trust is rebuilt, not through speeches about urgency alone. Others resisted that advice, fearing dilution more than defeat. They worried that once you start conceding details, you invite endless obstruction. Better, they argued, to keep the pressure high and the language big. But that approach assumes an audience willing to suspend disbelief indefinitely. The town hall cracked that assumption by showing what happens when disbelief shows up uninvited. The contrast with Vance's style became a recurring point of analysis. Supporters praised his calm, framing it as seriousness rather than smugness. Critics accused him of hiding ideology behind arithmetic, as if numbers were neutral. Yet even that critique conceded his central advantage. He looked prepared. Preparation is boring until it's missing, and then it becomes everything. In classrooms and comment sections alike, people replayed the same moments. Not the heated exchanges, but the pauses. The seconds where an answer should have arrived and didn't. Those gaps became symbols, filled by whatever the viewer already believed. For skeptics, they confirmed suspicion. For supporters, they sparked anxiety. The larger cultural question started to surface beneath the partisan noise. What does political leadership look like in an era where attention is currency? Is it enough to articulate values? Or must leaders also demonstrate operational literacy on demand? Social media rewards immediacy and confidence, not caveats and spreadsheets. But government punishes ignorance mercilessly, regardless of follower count. In this extended narrative, some young voters felt betrayed, though they struggled to articulate why. They still believed in the goals, they just felt misled about the readiness. It's one thing to dream together, it's another to realize no one packed the tools. That realization doesn't turn people conservative overnight. It makes them cautious, which is often more damaging. Meanwhile, opponents didn't need to invent new attacks. They simply recycled the footage and let the questions echo. Every campaign ad, every interview clip, every debate setup pointed back to the same theme. Explain how, delivered without sarcasm, became the catchphrase. And because it sounded reasonable, it was hard to dismiss as partisan cruelty. The progressive movement itself began to fracture along familiar lines. Some argued the lesson was better preparation, better staffing, better policy depth. Others argued the lesson was to avoid mainstream platforms that demand this kind of specificity. That split revealed an uncomfortable truth. Avoiding scrutiny is not the same as surviving it. Eventually, someone will ask, and the answer will matter. AOC's star power didn't vanish, but it changed texture. She remained influential as a cultural figure, a rallying presence, a symbol. But symbols operate differently from legislators. Symbols inspire. Legislators allocate. The town hall blurred those roles, and the blur cost her credibility with people who care about the latter. As months passed in this imagined timeline, the memory of the event hardened into shorthand. The math night, some called it, half joking, half wincing. It became a reference point in debates about progressive policy. Supporters would say, "Don't let it turn into another math night," meaning prepare. Opponents would say it with a grin, meaning the opposite. Even those who thought the criticism was exaggerated admitted something fundamental. The proposals had been marketed as inevitable futures rather than contested designs. Inevitability is powerful until it meets resistance, then it collapses fast. Because inevitability discourages questions, and questions are how designs improve. When questions finally arrive all at once, they feel like a tax instead of maintenance. In this story, the irony is hard to miss. A movement built on demanding accountability from institutions stumbled when asked for accountability itself. That doesn't make the movement hypocritical. It makes it human. But politics is unforgiving about timing, and the timing here was brutal. The lesson landed not as theory, but as spectacle. What made the episode endure wasn't cruelty or mockery. It was the sense that something essential had been revealed accidentally. Like watching someone realize mid-presentation that they skipped a chapter. You don't need to hate them to notice it. You just can't ignore it once you do. As analysts continued to dissect the exchange, a quieter conversation emerged. About whether American politics has trained a generation of leaders to speak beautifully without governing deeply. About whether outrage cycles crowd out the slow work of policy formation. About whether we mistake fluency in moral language for fluency in institutional mechanics. Those questions lingered longer than any clip. In that sense, the imagined town hall became less about AOC as an individual. She was the focal point, not the cause. The cause was a system that rewards speed over substance until substance is demanded publicly. When that demand finally appears, the reckoning feels sudden, but isn't. It's just delayed. For viewers trying to make sense of it all, the takeaway was unsettlingly modest. No grand ideology triumphed, no philosophy was definitively disproven. Instead, a basic expectation resurfaced. If you want to redesign society, know how the redesign works. If you can't explain it, someone else eventually will, and not in your favor. That expectation isn't radical, it's foundational. And so the story stretches forward without a clean ending. AOC remains a figure people argue about, project onto, defend, and criticize. Vance remains a figure whose method is praised by some and distrusted by others. But the exchange between them, real or imagined, crystallized a tension that isn't going away. Between passion and preparation, between performance and planning, between believing and building. In the end, the most persistent echo isn't a taunt or a slogan. It's a question that sounds almost boring until it isn't. How does it work? Who pays for it? And what happens when it doesn't go the way the speech promised?